Well, thank you very much. I'm always honored to come to Korea. I find Korea to be one of the most inspiring countries in the world. When I think of how poor Korea was as recently as the 1960s and how rich it is now, one only would wish that South America and Africa and the Middle East could have done what Korea did. I find Korea a terribly inspiring place. I must also apologize a little bit. The day that I was supposed to give these slides to you, my wife was ill and we had to take her to the hospital, and I accidentally sent you some slides that were designed for a talk at the Bank of Japan. So you will find in the printed version of the slides a little bit of Japanese and references to Japan, which I had taken out. So I do apologize. I know that there's nothing more insulting to a Korean than than to be compared to a Japanese. This is a study that I've been working on for 3 years now with Professor Jean Kandel and Yishe Yaffe of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Konstantin Kosenko, who's an economist at the Bank of Israel. And Israel, as you may know, has a tribal system very similar to Korea's, and they were concerned about the political influence of their tribals, and Professor Kandel led a committee there that has imposed new rules that seem to be very effective in breaking up the Israeli tribals. And so the Israeli tribals are in the process now of being taken apart. So let me talk a little bit about what motivates this. Of course, as you know from the previous discussion, firms in the United States look very unusual. This is 3M Corporation, the maker of Scotch tape. It is almost 100% owned by small shareholders. Small stakes by a mutual fund owns 2% or 3% is a big shareholder in 3M. Most shareholders own a few thousand shares. The three families that founded 3M, the board of directors, the officers, all together own about 0.5% of the stock. So 3M is very widely held. There isn't a controlling shareholder. The other distinction about U.S. firms is that listed U.S. firms do not typically control other listed U.S. firms. So 3M does not control any other listed firms. 3M is not controlled by any other listed firms. Each firm is separate. And the United Kingdom, the U.S., to a lesser extent Japan. Japan does have different kinds of business groups, but they're of a very different structure. Most other countries tend to have a lot of instances of listed firms controlling other listed firms. So in Sri Lanka, 65% of all the listed firms have immediate controlling shareholders as other listed firms. Korea falls into the middle there, and I think that's in part because the Korean groups have this circular ownership, which can obscure the importance of block holdings in some cases. Korea has pyramidal-shaped holding companies, structures where you have a family that controls a first tier of listed firms, those then control other listed firms, those control other listed firms. That's the way most business groups, most tribal in most countries are organized that way. So you'll find structures like that in Israel, Spain, Italy, Canada, throughout Latin America. The structure of a web of interconnected ownership, which you do find in Korea, at least in some periods in time, is very unusual. The only other place you see that is in the Japanese keiretsu, which don't have controlling families, so they are somewhat different. But this is the typical business group structure. A family controls a first tier of listed firms, which then control other tiers of listed firms, and more listed firms. Now, the thing that's most interesting about this structure is that the family only needs to control the top firm, and then it controls all of these other firms. So you can take a family that has a few $1 billion in wealth, and it can end up controlling a corporate group worth $100 billion. or $200 billion, just by having more and more companies being subsidiaries of each other. And this is something that the South Americans have taken and made an art of. You have very small numbers of families controlling essentially the macro economies, the whole economies of South American countries. 4 families in Colombia control almost all the listed firms in the country. 13 families in Brazil together control almost all of the listed large companies, not including the Novo Mercado, which is an interesting experiment that Brazilians are running. And there's a discussion about family governance and the virtues of family governance. These pyramidal business groups typically are each controlled by a powerful old moneyed family. And one of the reasons that, like I give talks to family business people, and they don't really want to say it, but one of the things that I think that really is an underlying reason why they believe in these family groups so much is they really believe that talent and intelligence are inherited. And so you have a brilliant father, then you will have a brilliant son. And so family succession ensures that you have very smart, talented people in charge of the family business group. A second thing that one gets from these conferences on family business is sometimes very long explanations of the family's system of values and how the family has within it a superior system of ethics that puts it on a higher plane that ordinary professional managers would never manage. Families also take a long-term view, and this is one of the most interesting things. So there's absolutely no evidence that this is true. This is something that's true because people have said it over and over and over again. But in fact, there isn't a single convincing study out there that shows that family firms do more long-term investment or anything like that. It's just simply not true. And then the idea that the firm and the family are sort of one. If it's a family firm, the firm is something that the family really takes pride in and worries about. Now, each of those things can be made to sound like a good thing or a bad thing, depending on which sorts of exact words you use to discuss it. And I think increasingly I'm coming to the view that in very early stages of capitalism, when a country is just beginning to industrialize, these things can actually be good things for the most part. And these family business groups can serve a role in very early stages of economic development. But then as soon as the economy gets to a certain level, the negative aspects of these family controlled business groups tend to outweigh the positive aspects. Now, the United States was not always as it is now. And what the main thing that we've done with this project is we've constructed at great expense and with much blood and sweat, a database of the corporate ownership of the United States in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And the United States, thank you, had very large business groups, quite similar to Korean Chaebol in the 1920s and 30s. This is hard for you to read. Let me just skip over this. But basically, the business groups looked very much like the Lotte or SK or LG groups in Korea. This is one of the largest, the Insul Group. There were 2 companies at the top controlled by somebody named Samuel Insul. And then each of those companies together controlled 4 other companies, which collectively controlled yet another. And underneath each of the companies, you can see a little blue line. That blue line means that there are hundreds of other companies below each of those companies in a huge structure that, well, hundreds, probably less, well, in total, all of the sub-companies add up to about 360. So perhaps about 100 or maybe a little bit less than 100 companies underneath each of those. Other business groups in the U.S., Pennsylvania Railroad, Middle West, United Group, and so on. Now, that is something that came to the United States in the early 20th century. The United States actually had business groups in the 19th century as well. The United States did its industrialization in the 1870s and 1880s, and by the 1890s, the United States had become an industrial country. During the 19th century, the United States courts had ruled that corporations could not own shares in other corporations. It simply wasn't allowed. Only biological persons, only real persons could own stock in a corporate person. And the way the United States had business groups at that time was something called a voting trust. So what would happen is J.P. Morgan or John Rockefeller would organize something called a voting trust. And a voting trust was a sort of an investment company where the tycoon who controlled the company, J.P. Morgan, would actually control all of the assets of the voting trust, and outside investors would be given non-voting units in the trust. So a typical investor in the United States would own non-voting units in a bunch of these different trusts, and then the voting trust would control a bunch of corporations that would be the actual operating companies. Now this achieves a complete separation of ownership from control, because the owners are the people with the non-voting units in the trust, and the control is by the person who controls the trust. And in theory, the person who controls the trust might own none of the units in the trust. In practice, they own some. But this gives you separation of ownership from control without pyramiding, without circular ownership, whatever. And this is the way business groups were initially organized. This is the way J.P. Morgan built his business group, the way the Rockefellers, Thomas Edison, and so on built their business groups. These were attacked in the 1880s and then more effectively in the 1890s with something the Americans call antitrust law. And if you've wondered why do the Americans call their anti-monopoly law an antitrust law? That's a funny word for it if you think about it. Well, the reason is that it wasn't actually designed to be against monopolies so much as it was designed to be against these voting trusts. This was the first attempt of the United States to break up their business groups. And so they had laws that subjected these voting trusts to investigations about whether they were engaging in price fixing, attempts to take advantage of consumers by restraining competition. So anti-monopoly and antitrust in the United States began as the same thing. The way the American business groups got around the antitrust laws was to stop being voting trusts. And what they did is they began to reorganize themselves into pyramidal business groups. New Jersey was the first state to allow corporations to own stock in other corporations, and so companies began to reincorporate as New Jersey corporations so that they could then change their structure from voting trusts into tiers of pyramids. Other states began to imitate New Jersey, and the most effective, of course, was Delaware, which made organizing pyramidal business groups very, very easy. By the 1920s, pyramidal business groups were all over the place in the United States. This is a graph of the different pyramidal business groups in the United States and the formation dates. The ones that were formed before 1910 were typically pre-existing voting trusts that reorganized themselves into pyramidal business groups. The ones between 1913 and 1920 were newer ones. Some of them were not pre-existing, and the ones formed in the 1920s tended to be brand new. If we look in 1928 at the New York Stock Exchange, there were 572 listed firms on the NYSE in 1928, and about 2/3 of them were companies whose assets were a mixture of property, plant, and equipment and shares in other companies. The blue part of that diagram is listed companies whose primary assets are just shares in other companies, so we call those holding companies. The green ones are independent, freestanding operating companies that don't own shares in other companies. So 3M, if it had existed back then in its current form, would be a green company. That's a modern American company, and the red ones are companies that are mixtures. They have property, plant, and equipment, and they have listed subsidiaries as well. So you can see that the companies that we now think of as American companies, the green part of that pie diagram was actually very small, and most companies in the United States looked like Korean chaebols back in 1928. Business groups, pyramidal business groups, rose and then fell. So you had an increase in the number of firms and the total assets of the American chaebol from 1926 up to peaking in 1932, where chaebol companies in the United States were 60% of the assets of listed companies in the non-financial sector. The financial companies tended not to be so much in these chaebols, and so if you look at non-financial versus all companies, you get a bigger share of the chaebols. This is the number of companies in business groups in the United States. So the red is listed companies, the blue is listed plus unlisted companies that were members of business groups, members of chaebol rather than freestanding companies. Again, the importance of the chaebol peaks in about 1932. And here is the size of the American chaebols. This is the total assets of all the business groups in a chaebol as a measure of how big that chaebol is. And in addition to the number of chaebol rising and then falling, the number of firms in chaebols rising and falling, the total assets of each chaebol also rose and fall. Now this is a summary here. I just put this up so I don't have to click through all of these, but these are the diagrams of each American chaebol that we made by looking at companies controlling other companies controlling other companies. The biggest groups were the Morgan Group, run by J.P. Morgan and his family, Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Mellon Group. And then there were a bunch of others that were actually quite big. Some of them have as many as 5 or 6 tiers of listed corporations controlling other listed corporations controlling other listed corporations. Now, when we look, this is an average across all of the years, but what we find is, especially in later years, a lot of the pyramids became something close to almost 100% owned by other firms. So we get a lot of pyramidal companies where the control stakes are very high. The other difference that is somewhat distinctive of the United States, though not completely, is that many of the U.S. pyramidal groups did not have families in control of them. So this is the number of pyramidal business groups, the number of chaebol in the United States. This is the number of major chaebol in America in each of these years. The blue ones are chaebol that are controlled by a family. The green ones are chaebol that are controlled by just one business tycoon with no relatives. And so what we see is a lot of them are just controlled by some dynamic business guy, somebody like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, but instead of just controlling one company, controls lots and lots of companies. The second thing is that as we go through time, the fraction of business groups that were controlled by families decreased. So the family-controlled business groups tended to die out faster. And the business groups controlled by tycoons, by a single powerful businessman, kept on in place. Now, the tycoon business groups were also different in the sense that the apex firm wasn't a family firm. The apex firm was a widely held firm itself. And the tycoon was just the CEO of that top firm in the business group. So these were firms where the business group was actually professionally managed in the sense that Raymond Chandler would talk about later. The tycoon who ran this business group was somebody who was basically just a very powerful, dynamic, impressive manager. But the top firm was widely held, and it had to pay dividends to its shareholders to keep the tycoon in charge of that top firm so he could then be in charge of all the other firms in the business group. The business groups were spread across all the industries in the United States, but business groups were more prevalent in some sectors than others. So there's only 2 sectors in the United States where more than half of all the firms belong to business groups. Transportation and public utilities, that's actually 2 completely different sectors. Transportation at that time was mainly railroads. And railroads were often members of business groups. And then public utilities. Public utilities are companies like the company that brings electricity to everyone's house, the company that brings water or natural gas to everyone's house in a town. In the 1920s, these were new high-tech sectors. The United States was just connecting all of everybody's houses to electricity and to natural gas and to clean, purified water in the 1920s. And so these were considered new high-tech firms, sort of like internet connection has been in more recent decades. And most of the firms in those sectors were in business groups, also chemicals companies, more than half were in business groups. Lots of business group firms in metal and metal products, miscellaneous, some in rubber, food, mining, and when you get down to construction and textiles, almost no business groups at all. But most business groups were actually not in public utilities. If we look at the sectors that have the most business group, where most business group firms are. So this graph is, where am I here? Oh, I need to go back here. Yes, there we go. There, I can go back. Yeah, this graph is how important are tribal firms to each industry. This group is how important is each industry to the tribals. And what you can see is that the industries that were most important to the American tribals were transportation and warehousing. Second was public utilities, and then the industrial sectors were third. Another way of looking at how these business groups were organized across different industries is to look at intercorporate dividends. So what this graph shows is how important dividends were from different firms in different industries being paid to other listed firms. So we're looking at dividends paid by one listed firm to another. We're adding them all up, and then we're classifying them by industry. And so what you can see is that manufacturing firms were paying a lot of dividends into the tribals. So were transportation and public utilities, but a lot of the dividends were actually coming from finance affiliates. Now, these were not banks, so typically the business groups, a few business groups had banks, but many did not. These would be other kinds of non-bank financial companies. Most US business groups were also very, very focused. So what you would typically have is for instance, instead of Samsung, where you have a Samsung firm in electronics, a Samsung firm in construction, a Samsung automaking firm, you have firms in all sorts of different industries in each Korean tribal. That's true in some of the US tribal. So the Morgan tribal had a structure similar to Samsung with member firms in many different industries, but a lot of American tribal were very focused. So the Insul business group, the first one that I showed you, almost all of its member firms were in public utilities. And the Pennsylvania Railroad Group, almost all of its member firms were railroads. So the Pennsylvania Railroad Group was a railroad that controlled other listed railroads, and those railroads then controlled other listed railroads, but it was all railway companies all the way from the top to the bottom. The American business groups were also fairly large. The biggest one, the Morgan Group, the Morgan Tribal, had revenues of about 6.5% of the gross national product of the United States at that time. So 6.5% of the US economy was the Morgan Tribal. And if you compare that with Korea, the Samsung tribal in Korea, I called it pyramid, and that's not really right because it has a more complicated structure, but that's 14% of the Korean economy. So Morgan pyramid in the US was about as important to the US as Hyundai or LG are to Korea now. So they didn't have anything as important to the national economy as Samsung, but they had an LG and the Morgan Group. Some other things. Some pyramids were reincorporated voting trusts, but many pyramids were set up anew. In the 1960s, a new kind of structure emerged in the US called the conglomerate. And a conglomerate is a single firm with one CEO and one set of shareholders that has operations in many different industries. So a conglomerate in the US is not a company that controls other companies. It's one company, but it has operations in automaking and in insurance and in other things. Conglomerates that were put together in the 1960s in the US were not firms that were not made of former pyramidal business groups. The conglomerates of the 1960s are a new thing. Another thing is that dual class shares were not important in the US. We don't find a lot of dual class shares. Pyramids in Sweden, for instance, are held together with dual class shares, where you have two kinds of shares. One share has no votes or very few votes. Another kind of share has lots of votes. We think the reason for that is that the pyramidal business groups were set up so as to not look like voting trusts. And if you remember, voting trusts had these non-voting securities. So a pyramid didn't want to have any non-voting securities because it didn't want to be mistaken as a voting trust, because if it was a voting trust, then it might be subject to antitrust law, and you don't want that. The big event that we find in discussions of why the US decided to get rid of its chaebol is the crash of 1929. And it's hard to understand now how devastating that stock market crash was. We talk about how terrible the crisis of 2008 was, how bad the Asian financial crisis of 1997 was. They were nothing compared to the crash of 1929. The American stock market lost 92% of its value, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So imagine that you had a good job and you saved up money all your life, and you had $1 million and you invested it in the stock market in 1929. And then you saw the stock market crash, and your $1 million in savings by 1932 was worth about $85,000. Right? You would feel really stupid for having saved that money. It would have been much smarter if you just spent it on beer and loose living and things like that, because your savings were just gone, devastated. The Americans were furious with Wall Street and with big business, and they elected a succession of governments led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who campaigned that he would attack the business groups. And that was a central part of his campaign in his second and third elections. In the first election, he was going to attack Wall Street, and he didn't so much narrow it in as an attack on the chaebol. His two key advisors were Adolph Burl and Gardiner Means. And if you know about corporate finance, you know they wrote a famous book, Burl and Means, that described what they wanted America to look like after Roosevelt was finished with it. So in this book, what they said is America now is full of these chaebols, and chaebols are a terrible system. We've got to get rid of it. They called them pyramids, but basically they meant the same thing as the Korean word chaebol. And they said, if we do this, what we will end up with is widely held companies. And there are going to be some governance problems in widely held companies. You're going to have CEOs who are professional managers, and they may not care so much about the shareholders, but that's better than having these pyramidal business groups that we currently have. That book is often misquoted and misunderstood as something criticizing widely held companies. And it does have those criticisms of widely held companies in it. But to me, the most interesting part of the book is its attacks on business groups and on family-controlled business groups in particular. This is Roosevelt being driven to the White House with his wife to accept the nomination to be President of the United States for his inauguration. And in the car with him is Adolph Burl, one of the co-authors of this book. The United States had been concerned about business groups for a long time. One of the sources of pressure to break up the American chaebol came from the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. And the IRS was very concerned that the business groups were shifting money back and forth between them to avoid taxes. And so this is from testimony by the Assistant Counsel General for the Internal Revenue Service to Congress, talking about a big business group. I think this is the Insel Group, but it's not named by name, where he says every one of these individual listed companies told its shareholders it had huge profits. But then when they filed their tax returns, every single company in the business group said that it lost money and so wasn't supposed to pay any taxes. So we sent 1,000 auditors and investigators out to look at these companies, and we would chase money from one company to another company to another company, and each company would have some write-off that we would have to go to another company. Too complicated, and we've got to break these things up if we expect these companies to pay taxes. There were also discussions that business groups were disguised monopolies. The key reason that the government had attacked voting trusts a generation earlier was the concern that it would look like there were two railroads serving this city, but if they were controlled by the same voting trust, then they would collude, their prices would be set, and you wouldn't have competition. And that was the economic motive for the antitrust laws. People were concerned that pyramids were having the same effect. It would look like you had two companies that were competing in this city, but if both of them were part of the same pyramidal business group, then there isn't really competition. President Roosevelt himself wrote about how pyramiding doesn't really offer safety for investors, and he was concerned that pyramids gave the controlling family or the controlling tycoon's widely held company at the top control rights that were widely greater than the actual ownership rights, the percentage of the dividends that would go to the family or the top company. President Roosevelt actually wrote an article in 1942 that was published in the American Economic Review. And I think he's the only US president who's ever published an article in the American Economic Review. Now, I suspect it might actually have been written by Berlin Means, but it came out under Roosevelt's name. And so if you go to the databases and put in Roosevelt American Economic Review, you find this article, and in it he's attacking business groups. And he's saying we have to do something about these business groups. And the main thing that Roosevelt is really worried about, I think, is not so much monopoly or taxes or even corporate governance. He's worried about vast political power that the controlling shareholders of these business groups have. He's worried that a single family, by controlling a company that controls many other companies, that controls many other companies, that control many other companies, have control over so much wealth that they can influence political decisions, they can prevent the government from making needed reforms that are necessary to correct the problems that led to the crash of 1929. And so I think it's a fair summary of Roosevelt's AER article to say that he was primarily worried about what we would now call corruption, that these business groups had so much political influence that something had to be done or America was going to become a concealed cartel system after the European model. And there's nothing worse. It's like talking about Japanese to Koreans. If you call Americans European, they don't like it at all. What are you going to do? There has to be an attack on this concentrated, monopolistic, tax-evading, unsocial wealth in vicious, pyramided, conscienceless holding companies. That's from an article by Blakey, and Blakey were two other advisors, a husband-wife team, who were also advisors to President Roosevelt. So the first thing that is different about the US is the antitrust laws. Now, what happened to the antitrust laws? Well, maybe what Roosevelt did is he took the antitrust laws and he applied them to pyramids, not just voting trusts, but pyramids too. Well, no, he didn't. In fact, under Roosevelt, the antitrust laws were essentially suspended, because what happened in the 1930s in the United States is they had very high deflation. That meant prices were getting lower and lower and lower and lower every year. Prices were going down at 5% or 6% per year. And this deflation was considered a major economic problem. And so one set of advice that Roosevelt got was mostly from business people. And what the business people said is, if you want to fight deflation and get prices back up again, the best way to do that is have monopolies. because monopolies raise prices. So Roosevelt actually was convinced to suspend the anti-monopoly laws and allow firms to collude to set prices as a way of combating deflation. And so you had this sticker here, the National Recovery Act, a blue eagle. And if you went to a shop that had a blue eagle on it, that shop would charge higher prices because it was doing its part to fight deflation. And consumers who were patriotic were supposed to go to Blue Eagle stores and buy from Blue Eagle companies and pay that higher price to help combat deflation. So antitrust really wasn't a factor. Anti-monopoly laws. Now, there are a series of papers by Andre Schleifer and Laporta and Lopez de Solanas and Vishny and some of them that talk about the importance of shareholder rights. And if we look at the United States in the 1930s, they enacted two laws, the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, and neither of these really had much to do with what we consider shareholder rights now. So the 33 law was about having registration statements and prospectuses when you do initial public offerings. The 34 law had provisions about disclosure in it, but really what it was aimed at was preventing stock market manipulation. So during the 1920s, investors played games where they would release false information about a stock, the price would then go down, then they'd buy it, and then when people realized the information was false, then the stock price would go back up and they'd make money. So releasing false information to manipulate prices was a key thing that the SEC Act was supposed to be against. The 34 Act did have provisions in it for imposing standardized mandatory accounting rules to make accounting statements comparable and easy to read, but those parts weren't actually put into effect until the late 1950s. They were just sitting as a law, that's something that they might one day do. The guy who was put in charge of the SEC, the first head of the SEC, is this person, Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy. And Joseph Kennedy made his money by running illegal liquor down from Canada in the 1920s Prohibition period, we think, although that's never been proven. But also he was involved in a lot of these releases of false information in the 1920s to manipulate stock prices and got rich. And again, that's never been proven. Those are just unfounded allegations, and I'm sure it's fake news. But anyway, President Roosevelt put him in charge of the SEC because he said, you have to have somebody who understands all these tricks put in charge of the SEC if we're going to put a stop to it. So maybe shareholder rights had something to do with it, but the case is weak. It's actually a very, I think lawyers would call it sort of circumstantial evidence or something. It's not that convincing. Now, in the past, I've drawn attention in previous writings to the American taxation of intercorporate dividends. So in Canada, if a company receives dividends from another company, there's no tax. You just don't pay taxes on it. And that's true in almost every country in the world. So the only people who pay taxes on dividends are biological people with organs and stomachs and livers and things like that. If you're a corporation and you receive dividends, you don't pay taxes. Typically, that's tax-free income. And the reason it's tax-free income is so that companies controlling other companies can receive dividends without paying a huge tax on it. The first attack on business groups was in the Revenue Act of 1935, which imposed a tax on intercorporate dividends for the first time. They'd actually imposed a tax on intercorporate dividends. Well, here's the tax rate. They'd actually imposed a tax on intercorporate dividends during World War I by accident. So they wrote a very rushed tax bill when the United States entered World War I, and they didn't really write it very carefully, and it ended up taxing intercorporate dividends, and they didn't really intend it to, so they removed that again right after the war. But then Roosevelt reinstated it, and the tax rate started off at less than 2%, and then it was slowly increased, and it ended up getting to almost 8% in the 1950s. Currently, it's about 7%. Now, a 7% tax doesn't seem like that big a deal, but if you have a business group that's many layers deep, then that tax is paid when the bottom company pays the dividend to the second bottom company, and then again when the second bottom company pays it to the third bottom company, and so on. And so if you have a business group that has 10 tiers of companies controlling companies controlling companies, that tax gets up to 70%. The biggest US business groups are 5 or 6 tiers, so that gives a tax in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% on intercorporate dividends, going all the way from the bottom to the top. And that's a significant economic deterrent. We found some mention in discussion of why these business groups were being broken up. These are the names of some of the US business groups that this study says downsized or restructured or broke themselves up to avoid this tax. We can see intercorporate dividend income. This is the total amount of dividends paid by listed companies to other listed companies as a fraction of the total earnings of all corporations, peaking in the early 1930s. It fell in 1932 because that was the depths of the Depression, and so both dividends and earnings fell a lot then. But you can see that intercorporate dividends sort of peaked in the early 30s and then fell off again as a fraction of earnings, corresponding to the other diagrams I showed you about Chaebol being more important in the 30s. And that's consistent with these intercorporate dividends coming into effect here in 1935 or so. Across countries, I looked again at this data. This is the tax on intercorporate dividends in different countries all over the world. And it's basically zero pretty much everywhere. There are a few little asterisks here. Italy at one point temporarily put intercorporate dividend taxes in place and then repealed it again. It didn't have much effect, but that may be because nobody in Italy pays taxes anyway, so it's not really that important. The Korean situation is complicated because in Korea you do have such a tax. You're one of the only other countries in the world other than the United States. But it seems, so I've talked to Korean accountants to try and understand what goes on with this, and apparently there are loopholes where you can avoid paying the tax. And then the other thing Koreans say is, well, our dividends are so low anyway that, you know, a tax of such a low number is hardly important. But that's an interesting thing in itself, because studies of dividend policy around the world show that the way you get higher dividends is to have more shareholder rights. More powerful public shareholders demand higher dividends. Dividends respond to investor demand. So what that's saying, I think, is that in Korea, shareholders don't really have the strength to demand higher dividends. Anyway, one of the things we do find is if we look in 1926, we find a lot of American companies in business groups with intercorporate control stakes in the neighborhood of 30% and then lots 50%. And as we go through time, what happens is we get more and more, whoops, where are we here? Yeah, 32, 37, 40. What happens is by 1950, most of the control stakes are above 81%. Now what's going on? Well, in 1942, the Americans amended their tax law to say that if the business group parent company controls more than 80% of the stock of the subsidiary listed company, then there is no intercorporate dividend. And so what we see is, in order to accord with that law, we see American business groups shifting increasing their intercorporate equity stakes to above 80%. It's actually, I think it was 85%, but anyway, it's getting there. So the case isn't absolutely clear. We can't actually find an increase in the tax rate and then the very next day these companies start reforming their business groups. The data just aren't that good. But it seems like there was a general correspondence in time. Now, another thing that the Americans did was something called the Public Utilities Holding Companies Act. And what this said is, if you are a pyramidal business group and you're in public utilities, you're in power companies or gas companies or water companies or something like that, then you can only be 2 layers high. You can have a listed firm controlling other listed firms, but then you can't have a third or a fourth tier. You can only have 2 levels. And that was actually initially contested in the courts. And so even though the act went into law in 1935, there were court challenges through the 1940s as far as 1946. The key decision by the Supreme Court in 1940 upheld the rule about you can only have 2 levels in your business group in public utilities. So there have been a couple of papers. The most interesting one is by Bank and Sheffen in the United Kingdom, where they, so I'm not sure whether I should be mad about this paper or happy about it. Because what they do is they say that this theory about intercorporate dividend taxes is the classical theory of why business groups disappeared in the United States. And they attribute it to me. And so that made me feel sort of like Aristotle or Plato, right? Classical? That sounded good. But then they said it was completely wrong. And so that made me less happy. But I think that if you focus solely on public utilities, then once this legislation comes into place, you do see a very quick disintegration of the public utilities pyramids. Not actually a disintegration, but they go down to having just 2 levels. And so it does look like it was very effective, but you have to remember that most of the tribals and most of the tribal companies were not in public utilities. Most of them were in railroads and chemicals companies and lots of other things. So there's some very good work by Paul Mahoney looking at the different events that went into the legislative history of this public utilities holding company legislation. And Paris Gonzalez has some good stuff as well. This is divestments of companies by public utilities tribal in the United States. And you can see that there were a few divestments. This is when the act was passed by Congress, but nothing much happened until after 1940. This is when the Supreme Court said the act is enforced is to be enforced in the courts, and then 1946 was when the last legislative challenges were put in place. Most of the divestments occurred in the early 40s, 43, 44, 45. So again, as with the intercorporate dividend taxes, you don't see they put this thing in place in 1935 and then the next year all the pyramids broke up. It's just not that clean. But I think that this tells a story that probably the Public Utilities Holding Company Act mattered. And you can sort of see it again. This is the number of pyramidal tiers in public utilities pyramids, and you can see it does decline to 2. By 1950. So again, that's concordant with the legislation. And the number of affiliates in public utilities holding company groups almost disappears by 1950. So this is the number of companies in public utilities tribals. This is the number of companies in non-public utilities tribals. And so you can see both of them increase, and then the public utilities tribals dissolve much faster than the tribals in railroads and chemicals and other industries. So that is consistent with public utilities being specially targeted. So it's likely that mattered. Now, another big reform in the United States was something called the Glass-Steagall Act. And what the Glass-Steagall Act said is that if you're a bank that also is involved in the stock market doing things like mergers and acquisitions and owning stock in steel companies and stuff, you can't do that anymore. You have to either be a bank and just do banking, or you can be an investment company and you can do mergers and acquisitions and you can hold stock in steel companies and stuff, but you can't do both. And so the Morgan Bank, which was the central company in the Morgan Tribal, decided we're going to be an ordinary bank. And so they sold off all of their ownership stakes in American companies to a company called Morgan Grenfell in London. And so the Morgan Pyramid actually continued in the United States, but run by a company in London for a few years. And then the Morgan Pyramid finally did just sort of dissolve. I guess maybe, I don't know, but maybe running an American tribal from London was just sort of too complicated. But aside from the Morgan Group, which was the largest, there were only 2 other tribal in the United States, Harriman, Kuhn and Loeb and Stone Weber, that contained banks. No other tribal had a bank in it. And so the Glass-Steagall Act could only have affected these 3 tribals. And the Morgan Group also had a bunch of public utilities in it, and so it was affected by the Public Utilities Act, and maybe all 3 of them were affected by the intercorporate dividends. So maybe the Glass-Steagall Act mattered a little bit. Now, the Americans have another thing that they put in place in 1940 called the Investment Companies Act. And this is still taught in law school. So the Public Utilities Act no longer exists. It was repealed a decade ago. The Investment Companies Act still exists in the United States, but now if you take a class in law school, they introduce it only as regulation of mutual funds. This is the law that you have to obey if you're running a mutual fund. But when it was put in place in 1940, it was also an attack on business groups, on tribal. And what the Investment Company Act says is that if more than half of your assets are shares in other companies rather than property, plant, and equipment, then you are an investment company and you will be regulated like a mutual fund. That means you can't interfere in the governance of these companies whose shares you own except through the proxy circulars and shareholder meetings. It means you can't borrow, you can't lever yourself up, because we don't want mutual funds taking on debt. I mean, why should a mutual fund borrow money, right? That doesn't make sense. And so a fair restriction on what you can do if more than half of your assets are shares in other companies rather than property, plant, and equipment and inventories and things like that. When we look at the discussion of this act at the time, why did people want to do this? What they were concerned about was that as they started attacking pyramids with the Public Utility Holding Company Act and the intercorporate dividends and stuff, maybe companies would continue having business groups but restructure in another way to have a mutual fund controlling all of the companies in the business group. And so in order to keep that from happening, the Investment Companies Act seems to have been put in place. And since we don't find any new pyramids forming in the United States after the 1940s, it seems like it was effective. We find existing pyramids sort of staggering on, but then dying away. Now, some of the American pyramids did actually have mutual funds as their top company. So Transamerica Group had a closed-end fund as its top company, and that was run by a single tycoon. The Investment Companies Act had an exclusion in it. And the exclusion is if you own shares in other companies and your stakes in the other companies are bigger than 50%, you own more than half of the stock in your subsidiary companies, then the Investment Company Act doesn't apply and you can do whatever you want. And so we think maybe that's why we started to see peaks in corporate ownership at around 50%, although that could arise naturally too because that gives you 50% of the votes. And then later on after 1942, when the exemption for intercorporate dividends put in place the 80-85% threshold, then you see different things. The United States was also different from other countries in having a really high estate tax. So this is the tax that you paid on inherited income in the United States. Under Roosevelt, it was raised from about 20% to almost 80%. So when you inherit money, you pay 80% of it to the government. And it was thought that maybe that caused the breakup of business groups. So in order to check that, what we did is we looked at the deaths of the family patriarchs in these different business groups in the American tribal. So we look at the death of the old man who runs the tribal to see whether the business group breaks up just afterwards. And we find it doesn't. There isn't really a great correspondence. So a couple of explanations are possible for that. One is that there were smart lawyers even back then, and the lawyers found ways to not pay the inheritance tax. So that's possible. Another possibility is that the families anticipated that there would be huge inheritance taxes, and so they gave a lot of money to charity, both before and after the breakup of the business group. And the United States is really quite unique that way. The Americans give way more money to charity than almost anybody else in the world. And if we read about, so there are books about some of these business groups. The Morgan Group, for instance, when J.P. Morgan died and control was passed to his son, they ended up selling millions and millions of dollars in art in order to generate tax deductions to offset the inheritance tax, or donating, sorry, millions and millions of dollars in art in order to get tax offsets. So it may be that what happened was they would start donating this money, collect the tax deductions, carry them forward, and then when the guy died, then you don't pay taxes. What we really think is going on when we read Roosevelt and we read Burl and Means, though, is that the US had a broken oligarchy. And this is something that people talked about in the financial crisis in the United States. Simon Johnson at MIT wrote that the United States needs to break its oligarchy if it's going to not have another financial crisis. When you have these financial crises that are caused by people who think they're above the law, people who think they're too big to fail, you have to break that, or you just have another crisis. And the United States had a remarkable economic collapse. Labor force participation collapsed. Only 40% or so of Americans were even in the workforce in the mid-1930s. The unemployment rate in the US rose to 25% in 1934, 35, 36 when Roosevelt was elected. You can look at pictures of what the United States was like as a country in the 1930s, and it looks like the worst third world countries now. You had children in the United States who didn't have food. You had people who had lost their houses and their farms that were living in slums. This is outside of Seattle, almost where Microsoft headquarters is now. And it looks like an African city. Or the suburbs around a South American city. This is outside Washington, D.C. This is outside Chicago. So what happened in the United States was the collapse after the crash of '29 was so severe that it took a first world country and basically made it into a third world country. And people were furious. And the Great Depression was deeper in the United States than it was in any other country except Germany. This is industrial production in the United States went down more than any other country except Germany, and the Germans elected Hitler because of this. So the Americans got off lightly with Roosevelt. And the discussion at this time was that our finance leaders, our finance professors, and Wall Street, and our CEOs have gotten us into this mess. And the reason they got us into this mess is because they were controlling the government. They were getting the government to put all these laws in effect that let these business groups get bigger and bigger and more powerful, and we need to do something about it. And so Roosevelt went ahead and did something about it and got reelected over and over again. After Roosevelt died just before the end of World War II, this guy, John Kenneth Galbraith, became the economic czar of the United States. And he did not believe in free markets. He imposed a system of wartime wage and price controls that he actually kept in effect through the 1940s. So in the United States, the government was setting the prices of all sorts of different things, just like in North Korea, for a period. But we think this broken oligarchy may have really mattered. I mean, if you look at political cartoons from the period, there's just a barrage of vitriolic lampooning of Wall Street elites. Now, why didn't we find anything right at the time of these reforms? The intercorporate dividend tax went into effect. Why didn't we find the business groups breaking up right away? The Public Utilities Holding Company Act was upheld by the Supreme Court in this year. Why didn't the Public Utilities Holding Company pyramids break up right away? My co-author Yishe Yaffe is writing about this, and what he thinks is that there is a lot of work now in finance and economics aimed at getting identification, where we look at a reform, and then we look just before and just after the reform to see what the effect was. And what he's arguing is that's not the way the world works. What actually happens is you put a reform in place, and then you try and lobby to get loopholes, or get changes, or get it repealed, or get it implemented with a very low budget so it can't be enforced. And so you don't react to new legislation immediately. You wait to see if the legislation is going to be permanent. And so here's what happened. The Republicans lost the election in 1932, and you had a huge majority, 90% of the Electoral Congress votes for the Democrat, Roosevelt. And then in the next election, he got almost 100%, and then above 80%. So after a while, You say, look, we're not going to be able to get loopholes in this. We're not going to be able to starve the budget of the agency so it can't be enforced. It's not going to be repealed by the next Congress. Ultimately, we just have to obey this. But you don't do that immediately. You wait and you see. Now, I don't know if that's true, but a growing sense of permanence. These things are just the way of the world. We're going to have to live with it, and business groups breaking up. So if you want to get rid of business groups, I think that what the American lesson says is that you've got a whole bunch of different things the Americans did. They put a limit of business groups being only 2 layers high for public utilities. They put a tax on intercorporate dividends and really enforced it. They separated commercial and investment banking. They said if you're a company and most of your assets are shares in other companies, you're a mutual fund. And that means you can't borrow money and you can't interfere in corporate governance except through proxy solicitation and at shareholder meetings. They put in effect an estate tax. They had some movement towards shareholder rights. They had a history of antitrust law, even though it was suspended. Maybe what it took was this sustained multi-front attack. You're not just attacking on the Western Front, you're attacking on the Eastern Front and the Northern Front and the Southern Front, and you keep it up for 20 years, and then they disappear. So that's my discussion of how the United States got rid of its tribals. Thank you.